All righty, there we are. We are live, fellas. We are live, streaming live from Facebook. We currently have 0 viewers. If you watch down at the bottom right-hand corner, I would assume, yeah, I would assume we'll start going live here pretty quickly. So let's see if we get some viewers join, and then we'll start the discussion.
Jeff, if you want to start, we can probably kick it off with, I think we got a couple questions about detention and retention within the city limits and how it works. And we got a couple questions about detention and retention. I'm getting a little feedback.
Are y'all feedback? Am I feeding back to you guys?
Yeah, I can hear myself talk.
All right, let me just mute this then. I'll just use these earphones. I was just trying to make it easier. All right, guys, I got to bear with the earphones. All right, our viewership is gaining momentum. All right, so I guess we'll get kicked off. We got Jeffery Meyers and Christopher Michelli in live stream tonight. Jeffrey, let me pull up his bio so I can read it out to you guys real quick. I'm slow but steady, fellas. All right, Jeffrey's bio. It's Jeffery Meyers. He moved to Central in 1987 from North Baton Rouge, where he attended Redemptorist High School. Hey, go Wolves. And then obtained a degree in civil engineering from LSU. He then worked 5 years in Texas, followed by 27 years in Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. He completed his let's see. Sorry, I had to scroll up. Department of Quality. He completed his engineering career with the state, 3 years at the Department of Public Safety. And his work experience includes emergency management, hazardous materials, and he's hazardous materials, oil spill responses, general civil engineering, design, and construction. He's now retired. He's a local resident of here in Central. He desires to stay involved to improve the drainage in Central and offer more advice and suggestions. All righty, let's scroll down to Kris. Let's get his bio in here. So we all are on the same page. 1 second, for some reason or another, this Facebook is a little laggy for me. That's what's taking me so long. So I do apologize for the delay. And then we'll start off by letting Jeffrey start talking about the drainage for the A-meet and the co-meet. 1 second, guys. All righty, Christopher Michelli. Christopher's born and raised here in Central from roughly 89 till 2017, 2018. He attended Central High School from 2000 to 2002. He as well as a Redemptorist graduate. Go Wolves. We sure missed that school. I graduated from LSU in 2016 with a bachelor's in civil engineering. He works as a design engineer and a project manager in residential development for the past 3 years. He currently works in the state of Texas. He's completed over 20 residential and commercial design projects, oversaw construction, phases, services, complete bond applications, reports for development reimbursements, and recently promoted to project manager. I expect to take my professional licensing exam in October. My interests will lie within the drainage development impacts of the city of Central to help improve and understanding the awareness of design and common practices. So I think that no one can say anything about either one of you guys' credibility. I think y'all both are professionals and y'all both know exactly what you're talking about when we start talking about drainage. Jeffrey, if you'd like to start off, I think we have a few bullet points here. Kris, do you want to go over the first bullet point, and maybe you and Jeff can start off?
Yeah, well, the first bullet point really is going to get into the co-meet and A-meet, and maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the funding and where all the drainage goes. I think kind of a precursor to that may be the 2016 flood and kind of why maybe the co-meet and A-meet are issues now relative to how they were before 2016.
Okay, well, I can speak to that because back in 1990, I did a personal study of the two rivers, because I purchased property on the bank of the Comite River, just half mile south of Dyer Road. And what I saw was the last significant major event that led to work being done on two rivers was back in 1962. There was a pretty decent flood back then, and a lot of people don't know about it because it was all very rural out here. A lot of the asphalt roads were still gravel roads. And there's some established elevations from the 62 flood. And but needless to say, we exceeded it in 16. But that was a pretty good benchmark if you didn't look at the 68 or 1979 and the 1983 floods. So what occurred after the 62 flood, it appears that I'm assuming it was probably a combination of state of Louisiana and maybe the Corps engineer back then. They went and dredged the rivers. Now, they did some work down around Blind River. They worked on that diversion canal down there. I'm not sure what years that went in, but part of all that, they did dredge the Comite from Florida Boulevard all the way up to, but they stopped at the Hooper Road Bridge. And you can tell that if you're bicycling in that park there on Hooper Road, that's just south of Hooper Road, all the spoil, which is the soil that was excavated from Comite River, was spoiled up on the west side of the river. It was almost like a levee. So, but what you were left with when they stopped dredging, the river continued cutting the channel on its own going north. And I live in an area where the channelizing went by me and stopped at Dyer Road because of a large pipeline that has a huge riprap packing around it. And that kind of ended the scouring of the riverbed. And it also...
Jeffrey, if you don't mind, can you explain what riprap is?
Riprap is your limestone rocks. They look to be sizes from 2 and 3 inches up to 8 and 10 inches. And they use them for packing in riverbed areas because the river, they don't roll away as fast. They still can, but river water can't generally push them around a lot. Whereas if you have gravel and things like that nature, river water and velocities will push it all over the place. So they have a large pipeline that covers Dyer Road and dives off to the south a little bit. And they packed it in with this large rock all around it. There's in my area, there's 2 pipeline crossings that are done like that. And that inhibits scouring of the bed. So bottom line is the river lowered its and changed its channel. But both rivers are wild and scenic, and that's normal. So as a result of that, you had all this movement. It started flowing better, but now fast forward from the 60s to 16, 50 years time, nothing has been done on the 2 rivers. So over the years, all the silting has been accumulating. The rivers are changing their channels a little bit back and forth. You documented that in a video a month or so ago, showing where the A-meet is literally cut through some of its oxbows and isolate them, and that's normal. But you're still left with the trees, you're left with silting. In a sense, the riverbed bottoms are coming up. When they're coming up due to silting, you're raising the true elevation of flooding, not the benchmarks that they're using all the time. So that's my concern. I think we're looking at lesser amounts of water will achieve the same flooding elevations in the future. And that's the problem on these rivers. If you don't do your maintenance periodically, you wouldn't normally do it, but you have a population out here, and as a result of the population, you almost have to buy in on doing maintenance on these rivers probably every 20, 25 years to stay ahead of flooding problems.
And when's the last time have you seen maintenance on the Comite of the Amy, to your knowledge?
I didn't catch that. Saw what?
What maintenance, dredging of either one of these rivers, Comite or Amy?
I've never seen it. I only know that it took place based on the records. And the last time these rivers were dredged were back in the 60s. So they're past due on some maintenance work. Normally you wouldn't do it, but when you have 27,000 people living between the convergence of these two rivers, well, now you're going to have to take on that type of maintenance activity, and it has to be done periodically. If we get them done, if we get the dredging done here in the next 3 or 4 years, they ought to put a little check mark down and provide the funding to do it again in another 20, 25 years. Or you're going to keep having the same problems.
So if you were to speak with them directly as an experienced state employee and an experienced civil engineer.
Okay, I missed the first half of your question.
Okay, if I'm does. But I said if you were going to speak directly to Bodie White, Governor Edwards, what message would you give them about these two rivers and the problems that we're having here in Central?
Okay. I'm catching the last part of your audio is starting to stack up on me for whatever reason. But what I'm gathering from your question, if I was to speak to Bodie White or Governor Edwards, what would my advice be? And my advice is that when you do determine a course of action that you're going to do for correction, one of the major parts of any corrective action, and I have a lot of experience doing this working for the state when we mitigated environmental problems. You set up your corrective action. Within the corrective action, the last chapter is the ongoing maintenance. You have to have a commitment, because once you correct a problem, then you have to maintain some activity on a regular basis so that the original problem doesn't reoccur. And that's just simple common sense.
Kris, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So one of the things that you said was that one of the reasons that that maybe the canal, the rivers need to be dredged again is because population increase. Do you consider that because maybe it's impervious cover being added because of residential developments, commercial developments, just development in general? Is that your reasoning for thinking that? I'm getting a little feedback, but is that your reason for thinking that the rivers need to be dredged again? One of the primary reasons, or do you think that it was because some of the flooding issues that happened in August and a lot of the heavy sedimented river water coming through maybe kind of expedited the issue?
Okay. Well, the answer to that is a combination of two things. The first thing is, yes, with more people in the area since 1962, every time you bring a road somewhere, you bring the drainage on both sides of the road. Well, when you bring the drainage on both sides of the road, you're increasing the flow to whatever receiving stream that's taking it. Nothing has been done to the receiving streams, as far as I know, over the last 50 years. So you're basically, you're charging them up with a capacity they can't handle anymore. And we're now reaching that point because you saw it, the flooding was so prevalent between the two rivers in the center of the city, which is normally out of any flood zone, but they were flooded by their own inundation because their own streams couldn't get it away from them fast enough. Which leads to my second point about the number of people. Back in the 50s and 60s, I would venture to say instead of 27,000, you might have had about 5,000 people living out in this area. And those 5,000 people were probably historic people that had been here long enough that they knew where the highest spots were, because that's generally what you did at the turn of the 19th and 18th century, you go pick the highest spots where you put your permanent settlement so you wouldn't have to deal with flooding. Well, over the years, more and more people coming in, they're dependent upon relative designs and okays and variances from the governmental entities to come put permanent settlements and homes into areas that might not have the proper drainage to inhibit flooding. Or in some cases, an adjacent development could create a problem for an older development. And these are the things that have accumulated over years. It's not pointing my finger at one individual or absolute entity that allowed it to happen. It's a course of the evolution of things that have taken place, because government has gotten better in the last 15 years or so of identifying and mandating the requirements for proper drainage. We're just dealing with a lot of the older stuff, the legacy drainage that just is not conforming. And that's the problems we're having. But we got 27,000 people now. Do you imagine what kind of flooding problems we're going to have in, let's say, 10 years when we jump up to 40,000?
That's exactly true. I completely agree with that. Would you venture to say that the August flood would or would not have happened without if we still had 5,000 people living in the city limits?
Well, no. The flood of 16 is an aberration, and then I say it can't happen again. In what we saw just last year, 51 inches in Houston, and I never thought I'd ever see anything like that. But that shows you how Mother Nature actually has full control of what's going to happen in the event of a rain event. But coming back to Central, 31 inches of rain is just too much for anything. You can't design for it. If we designed to handle a 31-inch rain, all of your creeks and canals would be about 20 feet wide, and they would all be about 5 feet deep. Well, we're not there, and I don't think we'll ever get to that size. But that would be and you'd have to have those sizes, if for nothing else, just to store the amount of water that fell, because you can't get it to the rivers fast enough. But our second problem was not only Central, but Baker, Watson, Denham Springs, Zachary, all these communities, and even parts of the eastern side of the city of Baton Rouge, put water into those two rivers in such a short period of time. The actual rain event occurred early Friday morning. By Friday evening, both rivers were at full max, and no water had come down river yet from southern Mississippi or from Clinton. And what that happened, that water had no place to go but on top of the existing water. Now you have backwater flooding. And you may have had some people in Central that flooded Friday morning, the water went down, then the water came back up again and flooded them a second time, even higher. That was because of the backwater flooding from the two rivers. So you can see that rain event is unusual. And to try and put into place drainage that could handle that, yeah, I would almost say it's impossible in southern Louisiana, especially here. But you have to do something that's reasonable, and whatever they decide on. To me, I think really we need to go beyond a 100-year storm. We probably need to look at 100, 150, maybe a 200-year storm. That way or a 100-year storm with an engineering safety factor that increases the capacity above it. So you can pick up an aberration every now and then, like it would be tough on us if we had a 12-inch rain in 1 hour. That's just horrible.
That was actually my next question I was going to ask was, do you think that, so currently the ultimate standard for at least, a bedroom community like the city of Central is a 100-year design. I was going to ask, do you think that we should increase the limits? I've heard a lot of people talk, at least where I am, that a 100-year design may not be sufficient. And even, roadside ditch and channel flow for a 3-year design may not be sufficient because that pulls from your 100-year flow during extreme events. So I guess my question would be, or I guess my statement would be a lot of things that they started doing differently in the areas that I work is they started doing a modified rational method to where instead of just calculating the straight flow of runoff and rainfall, they actually multiply it times a safety factor per se of 25% or 20% or something like that to increase your ultimate capacity within your streams. Do you think that Central should do something like that? Currently, from my understanding, is the city of Central adopts a lot of East Baton Rouge Parish and Baton Rouge City design criteria. I guess a two-part question would be, do you think that Central should develop their own criteria, and do you think they should increase their own criteria considering the high level of floodplain between the two rivers?
The answer I would say is yes, Central has to develop its own because what they develop, the standards they set, is going to impact all future development. And what we're seeing right now, you don't want to set up a set of standards and everybody agrees with it. And then 5 years down the road, everybody's wanting variances to it because it's too tough. It has to be something that will stay and remain in place. If you want to say it's going to take 20 to 50 years out to actually show how well we do when we do set the new drainage standards, because obviously we'll be able to handle the bad rain events. But going hand in hand with this, we almost have to work with the adjacent governmental entities like Livingston Parish and the city of Baton Rouge and all, because you can't develop standards that are going to work for us and they develop standards, let's say, that are lower. Well, now what we may do is a more efficient way of getting rid of our drainage and dumping it on them, and they can't handle it because everyone that downstream, you have to be cognizant of what you're doing to the people downstream when you improve your drainage. So my ideas for improvement of drainage isn't always make it bigger, wider, deeper, and faster. I have lots of other ideas, and we'll get into it in our later bulletin points.
Right, and which leads into the next one is mitigation and floodplain mitigation, detention, retention. I think ultimately that's probably one of the biggest improvements that the city of Central can make is detaining or retaining or even possibly allowing infiltration from, to maintain within the developments.
That is going to be the key to it all. You're starting to see it now. People who ask questions about, well, what do you mean by detention ponds, retention ponds? I'll tell them, look at the Walmart that we have right there at Wax Road in Sullivan. That was designed by engineers from out of state, and they did a proper job of it because every bit of rain, every drop of rain that falls on Walmart and their parking lot is designed to go into those large green grassy areas around on the east and south side. And it's designed to stay there a length of time before it drains away. See, it's not just that it holds the water, but it meters the water out into the drainage that's going east towards, because I don't think they drain into the Shoe Creek, they drain east over towards Beaver's Bayou. So that large corner right there, which is quite a number of acres in surface area and a lot of impervious area, concrete parking lot and the roof of the building and all like that, they're doing it right. So they're holding their water before it leaves. And let's just say, for example, most rains, even you get a heavy rain, there's water in the street, it takes about an hour for the water to go down and drain away and the creeks start falling. Well, a place like Walmart's still holding all their water in those detention ponds, and they're discharging at a rate that'll take them maybe 4 days to empty. So that way they don't impact Beaver Creek. Well, that's the same drainage philosophy you have to take with all new development. They got to take and hold all their own rainwater for a length of time based on a design standard, discharge it in a volume according to the design standard for the receiving stream, so that it impacts no one downstream.
That's right.
That's simple. We got formulas and all that we as civil engineers to design what the exact measurements and all have to be. But for the regular layman to understand, that is what you have to do. Now, I hear lots of people complain, you put in a new subdivision here and it's causing runoff on me next door and all. And I'm like, okay, well, probably need to discuss that problem with the drainage engineer, the developer, and all like that, because it's not necessarily done that way. They don't build a new subdivision on a turtle shell and run it off on everybody on all the perimeter sides. It's not done that way. But you may have issues at fence line on the border of the development, and that should be taken care of by the drainage engineer.
So if you could describe, I'm sorry, Kris, but I'm just going to get into the watershed issue because that's the term that you hear that everyone uses on Facebook is watershed. They're watersheding on our property and they're flooding us. So if you have a new development and you have detention and retention ponds on that new development, is the property designed to maintain their own rainfall and their own overflow into those retention and detentions? And the watershed, as the term is used by them, are you watershedding on any other properties because of it?
I can touch on this one a little bit. So generally when they start a development in the central area, they'll do a drainage study and they'll determine how much runoff is coming off of that property into wherever it's designed to concentrated flow out. If that drainage study shows that they're draining off too fast for too much impervious layer, or maybe your velocities are too high or whatever it may be, then they will have to provide some sort of way to limit. You don't want to raise water surface elevations downstream on anybody else. That's ultimately the idea. Usually the way they calculate detention and retention is anything within 100-year floodplain must be mitigated per volume. So if you plan on filling in 100-year floodplain, 100,000 cubic yards of dirt or 10,000 cubic yards of dirt, you will have to replace that in detention on site or retention to mitigate that runoff. That's a lot of the ways it's done. And another thing, one of the questions that I got was, what's the difference between retention and detention? And I'll touch on that real quick before Jeffrey chimes in. A retention pond is basically a hole in the ground that retains water. It doesn't have any sort of outflow. It's just a hole in the ground, and it's designed to hold a certain volume, a certain capacity of water. Detention, usually a retention pond is a wet bottom pond. People think of it as a fishing pond or something that looks pretty, but usually most of the time, especially with newer developments, is they're designed for a purpose. A detention pond can be dry or wet bottom ponds, generally dry, and they temporarily hold water. They'll fill up to a certain level, and then they may have some sort of overflow structure or some sort of elevated pipe structure that's allowed to reduce flow out of that subdivision at a certain rate. So that's pretty much it.
I spent a year in Florida in the 1980s, and they were at the forefront of all this drainage stuff because I was in Tampa. Their issue was to keep all the rainwater out of Tampa Bay because it was making it polluted, and it was actually killing fish and whatnot. So the design in Florida, which is the state of Florida, is nothing but a giant sandbar from Georgia south all the way down to the Keys, where every design for drainage there required retention ponds because you took whatever your development was and you had to set aside sometimes up to 30% of the property for a retention pond where all the stormwater ran into that pond and sat, and it percolated into the ground because the ground was sand. and it would eventually get down to the limestone and recharge the limestone. So, because they were having all the sinkhole problems, and they still do have sinkhole problems. Unfortunately, here you're not going to see retention ponds per se, because the ground, the clay is so impervious, it doesn't really move through the soils going down to recharge anything, unless you breach the upper sand aquifers, which are not potable. There are a few directly below us. And you could set it up to where a retention pond would recharge one of those, but you have to get permission to do that. It involves the Geological Society, and DOT, I think, also has some say in it. But most of the time, the design is normally a detention pond like Walmart has. Now, if some of the things we're going to discuss later about green space, if the developer wants to develop his ponds in a manner that they're a hybrid of a detention retention, it would be an elevation changing pond. In other words, he could have a large area pond that could rise 2 foot and hold the water from his development and slowly discharge it out the spillway to come back down to the normal elevation. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's still a detention pond with a wet bottom, and then he can use it for his architectural decoration, green space, or whatever. And that would be one of my suggestions. And I think we might see something like that at Shoe Creek.
I believe so.
My question to you, if you don't mind, if I could jump back, slightly back. We talk about detention and retention, what they are. I guess my original question are under current engineering designs, the way that you're designing these, let's take Shoe Creek. Let's just use that as an example. Is Shoe Creek able to watershed into Comite Hills? Is it able to watershed into Morgan Place?
No, not. You shouldn't cause any adjacent issues with any other property. So even if you elevate your property, say you have to put retaining walls along the entire boundary of your property, you elevate it. You shouldn't flow anything off of that boundary onto your adjacent property. I think a lot of people mistake maybe an elevated adjacent newer development with problems for cross drainage. I think they're thinking that maybe the development is draining onto them when it's actually not. I think sometimes you have these older developments that weren't designed with current modern standards in mind. You have a lot of really, really flat lots. And sometimes they cross drain maybe in a direction that they weren't supposed to. Perhaps they've been cross draining onto somebody else's property for the last 30 or 40 years, even though they weren't supposed to. And then now you have a new development that comes in, and maybe it causes a little bit of problem there, even though you're supposed to take that in consideration when you design. But I think that could be an issue that people are misinterpreting.
Let me give you another example. I think I spoke to you about it earlier today, Jeffrey. Is you hear a lot of the guys on the social media, the local, their assumptions, and it makes sense. If you're not studied as a civil engineer, it actually makes sense. So what you'll hear people say is if you take a bowl of water and you take a rock and you drop it inside of that bowl of water, the level of that bowl of water is generally going to rise, which then causes some of the flooding. So to clear up that misconception, Jeffrey, if you don't mind, I'm going to give that one to you because Kris took the last one. To clear that misconception, explain that for us, please.
Okay. If they designate floodplain areas, drainage areas, whatever, we're in let's say, the Comite River floodplain. And if you're doing a development in the floodplain and you want to raise something up and bring in fill, you have to get it from the same floodplain so that you have what is called a zero-sum game here, where taking volume from one area and placing it in another area does not impact the overall volume of the floodplain. Now, it's usually best if you have a development, let's just say 50 acres, and you're going to raise up half of it and you use 25 acres to make your giant, let's say, detention pond. You dig it out and you put it on the other 25 to raise it up. You've affected no one around you because the everything was taking place in the same floodplain, and that's the idea about that. Now, with that said, that means you cannot bring in river silt from Mississippi River Bridge, or one of those operations up and down the Mississippi River. You cannot bring that fill into the central area and build up with it, because now you're in materials outside the floodplain, and it's not allowed. You know, I won't say it doesn't or hasn't ever happened, but depending on how vigilant the inspectors are, it should not be allowed to happen. The only thing I think they don't have anything negative to say about, and even me, you buy your limestone from the river and you come in and it's a coating on the ground for your driveways and things like that, because we don't have any limestone in the Comite River basin area. So that's about the only material that I see it comes in from the outside. The only other thing is concrete, when concrete's made up and come in and form your slabs. But you're talking insignificant volumes there. But you're not talking an insignificant volume if you're looking at raising acre or two 5 feet. That's a large volume of soil materials. It has to come from within the same drainage area.
Kris, if you take the part and describe our floodplain, are we in some sort of a bowl?
No, I don't think Central's really necessarily in a bowl. I don't think that's really a good analogy to say that you drop a rock in a glass of water and it raises a little bit. It's not the same. It doesn't work the same way. I mean, I don't even know how to begin to debate that.
Well, I can describe it for you. You have two rivers that are coming to one point on Florida Boulevard, and you have the land between the rivers. All right, Louisiana is flat, so it's a slight mound. If you go from one riverbed, if you start, let's say, at Indian Mound and go straight due west all the way to roughly Four Corners or whatever, Deerford Road and Tucker Road, those areas, you have a slight rise, and it's just in a matter of a few feet. We don't have a mountain. We don't have tall hills or anything like that.
Or valleys.
That's the issue we have. You don't have enough elevation difference. But what's in the middle is generally in your non-flood area. Technically should not flood. But there was areas that it flooded because 31 inches fell on them and the water couldn't get away from them fast enough. It was headed to the two rivers. But generally, as a rule, normal rainfall, normal flooding and all, you don't see flooding in the middle of Central in the area. But we have issues within Central now where the drainage bayous, like we'll use, for example, Beaver Bayou, people up on Denham Road, there's been so much development up there, they shed their water a little too fast for Beaver Bayou, and then everyone south of Denham Road, Hooper Road and lower, are seeing the impacts on Beaver Bayou that's just not big enough to handle what's coming at it. That's where you have flooding, not in a 100-year flood zone, but you're having it due to inability to properly drain. These are the things that are going to have to be taken into account in designs to mitigate that. That's why I'm involved.
I think with proper mitigation, and if they take a look at dredging out Beaver Bayou, Comite River, Amite River, I think a lot of these issues will be solved. I mean, you can never completely solve drainage. You can never design for every situation. Like Jeffrey said, you'd have ditches that are 20 feet wide and 5 feet deep everywhere. That's just not reasonable. But for practical applications, I think that maybe they should look into being maybe higher standards on mitigation volumes, mitigation techniques, and design criteria. And I think the money that was just afforded to the city of Central and even Livingston from Garrett Graves and the Comite Diversion federal funding will do a lot of good.
what's your next bullet point? You ready to move on?
Yep. My next bullet point, we can go into green space. I think we talked a little bit about it, but I think one of the biggest things that the city of Central and a lot of the residents want that they don't see enough of is, recreation, green space areas, park space. And so one of the things that I found was it says in the Central, and I'll quote again from our last video, the Central Resiliency Study that was done by LSU says the threshold condition for when watershed shows significant impacts range from 10 to 20% impervious cover. So if you have 20% impervious cover in a sub-watershed area, you'll start to see significant inundation issues. I think if you add currently Central's around 5%. Maybe every area is a little bit different, but about 5 to 10% impervious cover because most places are only maybe 30 to 40% build out per the master plan that's currently in place.
Explain what green space is so people understand what we were talking about. In new development, green spaces, I assume, is what you're talking about. So explain to them how green space is negotiated with new developments and what generally most counties that you work in are requiring for green space.
It's different. Green space is just basically vegetated cover of land. You can, a lot of developers try to use their green space for retention or detention, or usually detention. And it's just, it just reduces the amount of impervious cover in an area. A lot of times they'll maybe put, a playland for kids or park or something like that without concrete cover. Maybe it'll be landscaping features, reserves for, anything. Go ahead.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. Do you know what the requirement in Central is? I think we're at 10%, isn't it? Am I wrong? Did I lose y'all?
I'm breaking up a little bit, but I think you said what are the requirements for the city of Central as far as green space? And I don't believe they have any requirements on green space. Usually it's a developer item. A lot of times developers will add these features to try to improve, square footage costs or, how much you can get for lots.
Jeffrey, you got anything you want to add?
I think the biggest thing is I'm not aware of if there is any green space requirements yet. It's a good point, and it's something I need to look up. I never thought of it. But it would go hand in hand with the drainage, which we've both been talking, all three of us been talking about, need to set some new standards for the Central area where you can work the green space with it because like Kris just said, the green space can actually qualify for, the drainage detention ponds can qualify as part of the green space because you're asking a developer to take his 100% parcel that he purchased that he wants to develop and section off a percentage of it to satisfy all his drainage requirements and green space. And I'm all in favor of that. It's been done since the 80s in Florida, so it can be done. It's nothing new. We just need to look at if we can work their drainage designs to where it may help, because we got to look at not only mitigating what he's developing so it doesn't create a problem, but we need to see if there's some of his design can help mitigate some of the other problems we have that are already existing. In other words, if the drainage system is coming through his development, what can he do to help with what's coming downstream from upstream? These are the kind of things we've got to look at in the designs and see if we can incorporate. It'll scare a lot of developers, but then on the other hand, developers are smart guys. They learn how to make money even Even
The
when
spreadsheet, they put everything on a spreadsheet, and they know exactly, generally, within probably a 1 or 2 or even 5% margin of what they're going to make before they even develop. So if we raise the bar here in Central, so if we take our P&Z and we say, okay, our P&Z, the bar level now, if you're going to build a 100-acre development in Central, you're going to have to be required to use 25% of that 100 acres as green space. Green space meaning parks, retention or detention ponds, as you guys described. Maybe a gymnasium, say it's a 200-acre plot. Maybe when you go from 40 acres, it's required to have a park. Maybe if you go to 80 acres, you're required to have a basketball court. If you go to 100 acres, maybe you're required to have a gymnasium, so on and so forth. And certainly that raises the bar out here in Central. It also raises probably property values over time because it makes us more, what would be the word you're looking for? Desirable aesthetics, and a more desirable community to be in. So if Central wants to maintain and be what I would consider the shiny city on the hill, using Ronald Reagan's quote, if we want to maintain that, we should raise the bar in our developments. And I think it'll appease both parties. I think that being that we're discovering that drainage isn't necessarily impacted so much by these developments. In some cases, maybe reducing some of the drainage issues that we have. If we raise the bar on the way these developments are designed and raise the bar on what requirements that are going to come into these developments, I think you solve two issues. I think just off of just my common sense brain tells me that you solve one issue with people that don't want development at all, period. And it also, because you're going to reduce those, it's because it's going to become more expensive, of course. So instead of being able to develop 150 homes, you're only able to develop 100 homes on that same plot of land. And so that way you're going to reduce some of the development. Some of the developers are going to come in here because the return is not going to be as high. The issue that we have now is the houses over off of Sullivan Road that they're building. I noticed in the MLS listing the other day, they're selling for somewhere in the ballpark of $175 a square foot in those houses. The average house in Central right now, 1,500 square foot house, is selling somewhere in the ballpark of 125 to 135. So they're getting, 35, 40% more for these newer properties and these newer developments, but they're not being required to put in some of these green space items that our community should require. Thus, we can reduce the profitability slightly on these guys. Thus, in return, it should reduce some of the development goes on. So then you're going to appease two sets of people that we have out here. You're going to appease the non-developers and the growthers, and we agree that there's two different mindsets on that. And so that should put it somewhere as a level playing field, somewhere in between both sets. That sound logical? Yeah,
and I'll also say that even if you require more green space, if you include your detention inside that green space, that reduces your impervious layer at 100% build out. So right now, per the master plan, most sub watersheds are expected to be around 15, 20, some even 25% impervious cover at 100% build out once that area is completely developed, that zone is completely developed. And the more green space you add, the less impervious cover you have in an area, and it alleviates a lot of drainage issues for a lot of people.
Anything you want to add to this, Jeff?
Yeah, it's going to be challenging for the developers, but it's not impossible. And the simple logic is if you take 100 acres of unimproved property, it shed water at a certain rate, all of its life for the last 10,000 years through a local stream. Developer's going to come in, pull out probably most, if not all, the trees and start laying in streets. He's going to have houses, driveways, roofs, and all. He's got to collect that water. Part of the design is such that he's got to hold that same amount of water that was discharged into the stream from unimproved property. He's got to hold it and discharge it at the same rate or less.
Less, right.
Then he's not a problem. And that's the simple logic behind what he's got to do. And I don't know if you arbitrarily say he's got to provide 25% green space or not. That's to be decided by Council and Planning Commission. But in those designs, once that's set in play, that's what he's using, whatever that green space requirement is, to incorporate his drainage mitigation devices, however he wants to do it. Because everything they want to do doesn't require power. They won't have to pay for electricity pumps and all that. They want it to be natural gravity flows. So that's how they design their discharge and not to impact a local stream. My thing was if he's adjacent to a receiving stream, might have to look at using his green space also to incorporate some of the volume coming downstream from upstream that's a problem volume. Maybe he can help mitigate 10% of the problem on that stream as it's passing him. These are the things that what engineers do for a living, and it's what we need to incorporate in our designs going forward in the new drainage designs.
All right. Yep. Have we covered green space? We want to move on?
Yeah, I've got one more topic. Should be a fun one. It's do you think Central needs their own drainage board?
All right, let me define that because maybe Jeffrey is new to that idea. What goes on in Livingston Parish, I have a friend of mine that's been a friend of mine for a long time. So what they do in Livingston Parish, a basic overview, is they appoint the council, the local council. They set up certain drainage districts based upon engineering data: District 1, District 2, District 3, District 4, District 5, so on and so forth. So each one of these districts have 5 citizens that are appointed to that drainage district board. In that drainage district board, they make basic decisions for their district. So if you're a District 1 citizens board, they pay those guys too. The citizens actually, they get a small amount of money per month to meet. They meet once a month. They have an engineer that goes to these meetings with them, and they also have an attorney that goes to these meetings to make sure they're following the law. So what they discover every month that's going on inside of the community, whether it's a creek, a bayou, or just someone's ditch that's running across their front yard. Kris, your mic's going off. So what they discovered is they accumulate that data, and then the drainage district prioritizes it based upon that data, and then instructs their crews what they want them to go out and fix in each one of these drainage districts per month. So I think what you gain by this is you gain the citizens' input to it, and you give the citizen control over directing what type of drainage is going on inside of our communities, that are instructing our drainage crews as to what ditches are causing the most problems at the time. And so they're able to prioritize it. And it also gives a community interaction, because some of the times you know the guy that's on the drainage board and you have a ditch behind your house. So instead of calling the mayor's office or IBTS's office, you're physically calling one of these drainage members and saying, hey, John, cousin, uncle, brother, I've got a ditch. My culvert is, every time it rains 5 inches, these culverts are going underwater because they're clogged up. And then John puts it on their list, prioritizes it. The engineer agrees with it, and the attorney makes sure that they're staying legal. What do you think of that concept and that idea?
I agree with it. I wouldn't have a problem at all with there being a drainage board. It's something the city council and the mayor should decide upon and initiate if they think it's going to work. I think the biggest thing I would charge the board with their first duties is do some research and find a handful of city essentials around the country that have been or are experiencing the same problems we are. Go visit. If they've started solving some of their problems, go see what their solutions were. Because not necessarily it's going to be different topography or different demographics and different geography, but there are going to be some things that are going to be the same. I mean, you could look at maybe a suburb of Jacksonville, Florida on the St. Johns River. That's an area that doesn't have a lot of elevation, but I'm sure that with the density of population there, they probably have some drainage problems, and they may have solved some. And they may have come up with an idea out of the box a lot of people hadn't thought of. And if they don't tout their idea, no one else knows about it. So, yeah,
well, I guess
my drainage board can do things like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I think my idea is getting community involvement to try to eliminate some of this division. I think we all can agree there's a big division that goes on in the community, depending on which political team that you decide to ally yourself with as to where the division is, and depending on which type of information you get. That's kind of what this video, these live feeds are about, is to try to eliminate some of that, take the politics out of this, and just simply biting down on the hard data. So I guess the idea of that would be, it's not necessarily that they can do a better job than IBTS does by making these decisions. It involves the community, and it has the community giving the community input. So you can have, one side, you have 5 members, let's say, and you can have 3 of those members on one side of the political debate and 2 of those members on the other side of the political debate. And they have to come to a consensus in order to start solving some of these issues, which then should also solve some of the divide in this community. Because really, I find that most of the problem we have in this community is the division. We can't get anything done because even though we're brothers, sisters, cousins, and neighbors, everybody thinks somebody's doing something they shouldn't be. I don't think that's always the case. I would say that it's probably rare that happens. It's possible, but I think that would solve. I don't think it's necessarily better for engineering. I think that it's better for community. I think it's better for the community to come together if we design it in that way. Kris, you got something you want to add to this?
No, I completely agree. The only thing that I have left on my topic is just one question from Alton. Alton says, and we talked about most of it, his questions about retention and detention. We pretty much covered most of his question except the second part. He wants to ask, after completion, are these retention ponds tested to make sure they meet engineering standards that were submitted to the city? Are there any inspection and maintenance requirements that the developer, engineer, HOA must perform to ensure the operation that these stormwater retention systems?
That was from Alton Ray Ashford. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Alton, to answer your question, retention ponds aren't really tested in a sense that they're filled up with a bunch of water and somebody goes out there and calculates how much water is coming out of the pond, or basically all that they do is once the pond is excavated, it's a lot of times they'll put in a clay liner to make sure that whatever water they plan on filling, whatever volume of water they plan on putting in there doesn't seep through and infiltrate into the ground. Usually it'll be vegetated after they put in the clay liner. What they usually do is they'll do an as-built topo. So they'll have a survey crew that goes out and does a topographical survey of the entire development, which is part of the city acceptance package. They'll do, they'll make sure that, the overflow structures or whatever sort of structures they put along with this pond aren't full of, mud and dirt and clay or whatever from construction practice. And then the city, once they do a final inspection, they'll accept it and they'll adopt it as their own, and they will maintain the facility. So once they adopt it, once they accept it, the city or whatever jurisdiction it is, sometimes it's just an HOA. It could even be private. They will maintain that responsibility for that detention or retention pond.
Jeffrey, would you like to?
Yeah. If the city has the capability to send people out to make sure that you set the culverts at the proper elevation and everything in your ditches in front of your house before you set a driveway, they can send people out to check the elevation of the discharge structures on these detention ponds and make sure that they are as per engineering specifications. Now, the actual functioning, how it performs later on down the road, no, I don't see where they've got people to do that. That would be the thing to do, but I don't know that there is anything in place to go back 3-4 years to a subdivision that has a detention pond and to look and make sure it's performing. Now, if what I am trying to propose in a lot of the drainage corrections, if we get our drainage canals and bayous and all back into a good shape where they can be maintained. And by maintenance, it means you got to go in there and probably bush hog them or whatever, keep the trees and the vegetation out. Well, if you're able to get into all these creeks and all and do the regular maintenance, whether it be annual or biannual, you're going to come up on all these structures that are off of these subdivisions. You're going to see how well they are or are not performing. So that will be found. But if you never go into these creeks and bayous that are draining right now to ever look at anything, you don't know how something performs other than until the water starts backing up. That's my best answer. But that's, like I say, I'm big on maintenance, and any designs that are put into place to correct problems in the drainage in our bayous and creeks should include maintenance. And maintenance should be something where you physically go in on a periodic basis and remove vegetation and fallen trees and whatnot to ensure the proper flow of that. And it has to be done regularly.
And I'll go ahead and add one little quick thing is I've always been a big proponent of curb and gutter over roadside ditches and residential developments, primarily because it requires a lot less maintenance. It's a little bit more expensive on the front end, but when your ditch, when the vegetation grows and you have trees growing in the ditch, people throwing cups and burning leaves in your culverts, you don't have to worry about a lot of those issues when you have subsurface conduit.
I will say, I will add one more piece to this because there's a little experience that I've had here recently. I know Livingston Parish, for example, doesn't maintain their retentions or detentions. The HOAs are required for them individually. So the HOAs, we had an experience just here recently in Livingston Parish, I think, because Kris, I relied on some information from you when that was going on, to where the HOA was deciding to start dumping old Christmas trees into the detention ponds, which my argument was a bad idea for this development. And there was no authority in Livingston Parish that you could call to complain and say, hey, tell these guys don't do that. That's a mistake. They didn't understand what the detention pond was actually doing. So they want to fill it in with Christmas trees for fishing structures, so they can have more fish in their ponds when they want to go out there and fish. And I argued the point that's a bad idea. You shouldn't do these types of things. You could cause flooding. You could start silting in the detention pond and certainly get away from what its intended use is actually for. And it's simply because they were ignorant, didn't understand. So I think the practice of city communities going out, throwing Central under the bus and saying they don't maintain detention or retention ponds, I can simply tell you that I can't speak for other parishes, but I can tell you that Livingston Parish doesn't do that, because I was actually involved in what was coming to be a litigation in Livingston Parish in regards to that exact same issue. The HOA decided to fill in their detention ponds with Christmas trees so they could start breeding bass and brim and sac-a-lait inside of their detention ponds. So I don't think that's an uncommon practice. I think it's a great idea that we should require that here, that the HOA is required to have an inspector come out X amount of years to inspect these ponds. I think it's a great idea, but I don't think it's a common practice currently for any parish or any city that's maintaining those retentions or detentions. Kris, if you want to go further into that, you're familiar with what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you pretty much said it all. A guy wanted to dump a whole 50 or 60 trees inside a pond and other debris, and I mean, it just had bad news written all over it.
Right, and no one inside of Livingston Parish took authority over it.
No, yeah, the HOA pretty much had ultimate authority. I don't know what anybody could have done about it, to be honest.
Well, the parish took no responsibility. Called the mayor, called Public Works, called zoning. None of those guys wanted to get involved. All right, guys, we're going to start wrapping this up. I believe we went into an hour. These things usually get a little dead after about an hour or so. We can go further if you like, or we can start wrapping this up. What do y'all think?
That's fine with me, but do we have any outstanding questions from those who have been watching us?
We'll take any. I haven't had anybody that's had some silly questions that we just kind of dismissed, but I don't think there's anything that, Michael, has there been anything that anyone wants to ask? If someone has a question, I see that we have quite a few viewers right now that are in any of these groups. Type them in your group. We have people monitoring these groups. Type them in now, and we'll have these two guys answer them for you. If not, if we don't have something next few minutes, we're probably going to wrap this up.
I posted my email in the chat. If anybody has questions after the video's over, they can email them to me.
Well, the one thing I would like the last point I would like to make is when we do go forward, when we do have the information from the drainage study and we start looking at it, to implement the corrections that are necessary, it's going to cost money. I mean, there's no getting around it. I don't think there's a pot of money sitting somewhere or rainy day fund or whatever that we can draw from, because this is going to be a substantial investment that will have to be made. And I'm prepared to have my property taxes increased to pay for this. And I think a lot of people are going to have to look at it that way. I will tell you that I'm against any kind of sales tax revenue source. I do not believe in sales taxes. I'm always for the removal of sales taxes. But if everyone in the parish, property owners, want to improve the drainage, reduce their threat to flooding and all, I think it have to be done with some type of taxing. And there's two ways to do it. One way is a pay-as-you-go, so it's a smaller tax. Or if you go with a little bit larger tax, then you're looking at to pay for a bond issue and get it all done. But every bayou and every creek in the city of Central needs to be addressed. And addressed means they have to go in there with crews that are going to probably remove trees and reshape the ditches, and it's going to be on the backside of people's property. They're going to have to be patient as a crew comes through. So the property owners along these creeks are going to have to be patient. But once all that's done and you start controlling the vegetation growth, which means they have to come back and probably bush hog a lot of these drainage canals after they're reshaped and all to where they operate better, that's going to be what we're looking forward to down the road. And I just hope everybody's willing to come on board with that. That's the way I see it. And that's kind of what I am striving to push to get the city leaders to look at doing. That's all I have to say.
Is that with Kris?
Yeah, I think is exactly right. I think what they do in the area that I'm at right now is they'll do bond issuances, and it'll be part of your water bill every month. It'll be an extra $1 or 50 cents or whatever it may be to reimburse for bonds. That's how it's done.
Let me just qualify that a little bit so that people understand what you're talking about. So could you do a bond issue just for Shoe Creek? That only impacts Shoe Creek.
I'm not sure how the districts are organized in the city limits of Central. I can only speak to the district locations where I'm at. As long as you're in some sort of utility district or within that district, you should be able to issue a bond just for the district residents.
You're talking about a public utility district for us, correct?
Right. I'm not as familiar with the public utility district structure, but where I am, we have municipal utility districts, and usually they encompass maybe a couple different subdivisions, a couple different developments. And when you issue a bond for reimbursement for whatever sort of facility they're proposing, or it will only impact the people of that district.
All right, I think that's a wrap. Anything else you guys have to say or want to talk about?
Nope.
No, I don't. I would like to make an off-topic remark. I want to tell the people of Central that be very happy that East Baton Rouge Parish was wise in their planning for the sewer, because we don't have sewer issues in this parish, in this city, like I've seen in other parts of the country. And I know it was a real tough, bitter pill to take when they started the sewer adjustment fees back in the 80s. But I will say 30 years later, you see where the East Baton Rouge Parish is already bringing another sewer line from the city of Central into the treatment plant coming down Hooper Road and all. That's a additional sewer capacity. It's being done before it's needed, not as a result of not having enough sewer capacity, because in the city of Tampa in 1984, they didn't have enough sewer capacity. They shut down all development, construction, fees, and everything for like 6 months till they could get their sewer treatment plants in running condition. So I'd like to say kudos to East Baton Rouge Parish and the sewer department. We're all providing sewer in this city.
Let's commit to doing one more of these, maybe, the next few days, maybe next weekend or something. Maybe not so long, though. Maybe not an hour long. And maybe we can talk about some of these MUDs and PUDs type issues, because I think that's where Jeffrey was going and what he was referring to. And I know that's where Kris was going. And so that way you can explain the difference between what a PUD and a MUD is, and what maybe we could do that's more localized for new development, with a bonding issue that's specifically for one area. So in other words, if you're building Shoe Creek and the city's responsible for upgrading Beaver Creek because of that development, maybe that could be a MUD or a PUD that only affects that development. And so maybe our next meeting, we can go into something like that. I'd like to add one more thing. As soon as we get off of this viewing, there's a candidate that we're going to do an interview with right after this. So we're going to issue the people that are watching, in the groups that you're watching from, we're going to issue another link here in just a couple minutes, and y'all, a candidate that no one's aware of is going to introduce himself. Anything you guys want to finish with? Other than that, that's a wrap for me.
Nope. Thanks for having me.
All right, Central. Thanks for watching.
Thank you.
We appreciate all y'all. We love you, and we'll see you again in a few minutes.
Okay.
Watch your local groups, and let's introduce you to a new candidate. All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Kris. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.